day that we as people from African heritage communities particularly reverence our ancestors. But not just our ancestors, it's also about us who live on, who carry on in their footsteps, and our progeny, our projections in terms of our children and our children's children. Today is known as African Emancipation Day. Most people would tell you it's Emancipation Day, the first of Mosiah, as we would say, after the Honourable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, but you would know it as August. And the 1st of August has been commemorated since 1834. Now it's the day when the Abolition of Slavery Act of 1833 came into force. Now it's called the Emancipation Day because apparently African people were emancipated from chattel slavery in 1834, apparently. But that wasn't the case. What this day did and why we observe it, why we mark it, is because this day is symbolic of the continuum of the Maangamizi, and it was a Maangamizi crime scene in the fact that the British Parliament passed this piece of legislation that legislated that enslavers would be compensated. Not the enslaved, not African people who had been enslaved, but enslavers would receive compensation for the loss of their so-called property in African human beings. That's what this day is about. And then when they tell us that we received emancipation, like as if somebody can really emancipate you, we've always emancipated ourselves, but they like to tell that lie, and these are some of the lies that have been agreed upon by elites in history. So it's not a day of celebration. It's a day when we have to remember what was done, because what was done has continued to be done. Enslaved African human beings were forced into a period of apprenticeship. See these words? They don't sound very evil and violent, but they are. Because what apprenticeship was forcing, again, African people who had been enslaved in different parts of the British Empire, so the Caribbean, Africa, some parts of Africa, some parts of Abuyala or the so-called Americas, over 800,000 people who were deemed to have been worth, in pounds, 20 million pounds. And so that was the 20 million pounds compensation that was awarded to enslavers after the 1833 Abolition of Slavery Act. There was in 1837 a Slave Compensation Act that was also enforced by the British Parliament to clean up all the unpaid debts. Now this debt that was taken out, that represented 40% of the budget of the UK Treasury of the time, was only paid off in 2015. So we're not talking about something that happened hundreds of years ago. UK taxpayers were helping to service this illegitimate, immoral, illegal, unjust debt. And then the British government has the audacity to tell us, the descendants of those African human beings, that reparations, in the way that we understand it, are not the answer. But they paid themselves compensation, and we know that the families of prime ministers, former prime ministers, David Cameron and others, of this country and other members of the British establishment received compensation. But they've all presided over governments that have told us reparations are not the answer for you. In 2001, when it was the World Conference Against Racism, the third World Conference Against Racism that took place in Durban, South Africa, it was the British government that was really stopping and lobbying the other governments of the European Union to not acknowledge the strong wording that came out of the mobilization of people of African heritage around the world into that conference, where there was a recognition that slavery was a crime against humanity. Now, because many of those who, this was a compromise document that was negotiated, 168 governments around the world accepted it, but many lawyers were drafting it, so they put some sneaky wording in there that said slavery was a crime against humanity and should always have been so. So what that means is that they're trying to be tricky and say, well, yeah, we recognize it today as a crime, but it wasn't a crime then. Now that's wrong, because it was always a crime. And not just in terms of our law as African people, but international law. And there were many British jurists and legal specialists who knew it was a crime. But it was Karl Marx that once said that law is the will of the ruling classes enacted into legislation. And what many of us are protesting today by way of this African Emancipation Day reparations rebellion groundings is the continuation of the imposition of a state of unjust law and unjust rule. And we stand because we have to speak for our ancestors and our foreparents who were killed, who were tortured, who were genocided. But if you know, according even to the 1948 Genocide Convention, killing members of the group is only one aspect of genocide. We in the Stop the Maangamizi, we charge genocide, Ecocide campaign, which partners with the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee, have since 2015 been organizing a march on this day from Brixton to Parliament Square. Now we know they're not sitting in Parliament, but we felt it was important to honor the initiatives of our people in 2014 that started the Reparations March under the banner of the Rastafari Movement UK, and there were other supporting organizations, including at the time the Interim National African People's Parliament that I was part of, organizations like the Global African Congress, and many, many others. And from 2015, when those who initiated the march no longer felt able to continue it, the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee, with the Stop the Maangamizi, We Charge Genocide, Ecocide campaign, have continued that march because our people naturally and righteously said we have to stand up and we have to keep on reminding the British state that we are not going to end our quest for repair. Holistic reparations are the answer, and the only answer which we recognize in its true holistic sense as being planet repairs. So we decided we were not going to march this year. We had decided we were going to lock down this area. And guess what? The powers that be were so terrified of the fact that despite all of the attempts to keep many of us divided, that this year in particular, we've seen a coming together of many groups of people who, quite frankly, wouldn't normally be together. We know that's true, right? Some of our allies here last year, I think, were a bit afraid too. But a lot of work has been done, because that's what the ruling elites have always done with the British people. They have been able to misuse the British people, send them all over the world to be part of their enslaving and colonizing missions. And we who are here in this time have been born for a purpose, because we are the ones who carry the knowledge and the wisdom of all of the generations. And those of us in Britain have a unique place in this struggle, because Britain had and continues to exercise empire. So if we are organizing here, we have a responsibility to all of our family and community members across the empire. And remember, it was Boris Johnson was talking about Empire 2.0. So let us not think that that's all gone away. So we're asking our people, and this particular space has been designated as the movement of movements internationalist solidarity grounding with the Pan-African liberation movement. Because in times of past, and more recently, I guess the best example is in the struggle against apartheid. The falling of state-sanctioned apartheid, because we know it still exists in an economic form and in other forms, but the falling of official state-sanctioned apartheid was something that, of course, African people in South Africa, Azania, and the rest of Africa, and across the African diaspora, led and championed. But we know, and let the historical record show, that a lot of solidarity was galvanized here and other parts of the global north. And today, in our righteous struggle, our sacred struggle for repair, we, the African people, we are the mothers and fathers of humanity. And our repair is going to bring about the repair of the whole. The whole. So everybody else's disrepair and dispossession came out of ours. And we have a civilizational responsibility as mothers and fathers of humanity to ensure that our repair process catalyzes that of every other member of the human family, and that's why we are here. Because we require all peoples of conscience to be about that repair, and we have our own way of formulating it and phrasing it. We talk about MAATUBUNTUJAMAA as a strategic goal, a repaired Africa that recognizes and incorporates her children, her diaspora, but an Africa based not on the colonial borders that were put there in 1884, 1885, that serve Europe to this day and continue to separate indigenous African ethnicity and nationality from each other. So we need that repaired Africa, because it's Africa's wealth and resources today that are helping to keep Britain great in its own way, in their sense of empire. So what we are really calling on people to do is to remember the generations that have gone before. And we as African heritage communities, of course, we remember those from our communities, but we also acknowledge many of those who were not of our community that stood with us Some of whom were persecuted, executed, terrorized, demonized. We remember people like John Brown and others who have always wanted to stand on the right side of humanity. So this grounding space is about us returning to that path, where we can form those alliances that we need to form, because the earth and what is happening to our mother, our global mother, and what continues to happen to our family members in the global south by way of the disproportionate impacts of the climate and ecological crisis. So it's no longer just about us, and even the taking away of us from our homeland was the beginning of this climate and ecological crisis that has just intensified. So we know that we have to be about a repair on a global, planet-wide level. And it's only in the last 600 or so years that we began to see, especially with the so-called industrial revolution that was fueled off of the labor of African people, Asian people, other colonized peoples in the so-called global south. And then that institution of dominant economic models, social economic models such as capitalism, and many of our scholars would argue racial capitalism. So that is what we are here to figure out. How do we put a stop to this harm of today? That is our historical mission. And we have called to these groundings that are taking place in between here and Windrush Square, our ancestors who are with us. They are with us. And we have called you to be part of that dialogue with us, because we need to figure some things out. Some things have gone wrong in our human family, and we have to figure them out. And we, as the mothers and fathers of humanity, are calling members of the human family together to ground with us, because you're not guaranteed any future if there's no future for us and the damage that is continuing to be done to our planet, our Mother Earth. So that is all I need to say, by way of just letting you know why we're here.